The sound of gunfire echoed through the foothills as Xavier Zachary urged his exhausted horse forward. The beast's hooves kicking up dust that swirled in the crisp October air of 1878. Blood soaked his sleeve where a bullet had grazed him, but he couldn't stop, not with those outlaws still on his trail and night falling fast over the Montana territory. "Come on, boy," Xavier whispered to his chestnut stallion. "Just a little further." The horse snorted in protest but pushed on, carrying Xavier deeper into the pines that blanketed the mountainside. As darkness descended, the sounds of pursuit faded, and Xavier allowed himself to slow their pace. He'd been riding for the better part of 2 days, trying to shake the Blackwell Gang after stumbling upon their hideout while tracking a bounty. Now, miles from civilization and with winter threatening, he needed shelter. A faint glow through the trees caught his attention. Smoke. A campfire, perhaps, or a cabin. Xavier hesitated, weighing his options. Whoever was out here might be friendly or they might shoot a stranger on sight. These were dangerous times in the territory. He decided to risk it. Leading his horse quietly through the underbrush, Xavier approached cautiously, his hand resting on the Colt revolver at his hip. As he drew closer, he could make out the outline of a small wagon with a canvas top, illuminated by a dying fire. No voices, no movement. "Hello." He called, keeping his distance. "Anyone there?" A weak cough answered him, followed by a woman's voice barely audible. "Help, please." Xavier moved forward, scanning the area for any sign of a trap. The firelight revealed a grim scene: a single wagon, its wheel broken, with a woman lying beside the fire, wrapped in blankets despite the warmth of the flames. Blood stained the ground beneath her. "Madam?" Xavier knelt beside her, holstering his weapon. "What happened?" She was young, perhaps 25, with dark hair matted against her pale face. Her eyes fluttered open at his voice, relief washing over her features. "Indians? 2 days ago," she whispered. "My husband, they killed him." Xavier looked around, noting the fresh grave several yards away, marked with a crude wooden cross. The woman had buried her husband alone. "I'm Xavier Zachary," he said, checking her wound, a deep slash across her abdomen that had been poorly bandaged. Infection had set in. Even in the dim light, he could tell she wouldn't last the night. "Cora," she managed. "Cora Myers." A soft cry came from the wagon, startling Xavier. He hadn't realized there was someone else. "My daughter," Cora said, her voice strengthening momentarily. "Elizabeth, she's only 6 months old." Xavier stood, peering into the wagon. A small bundle lay inside, wrapped tightly in a faded quilt. A tiny face, pink and perfect, stared back at him. The baby girl had her mother's dark hair and bright eyes. "We were heading to my sister's in Helena," Cora continued, each word clearly an effort. "The wheel broke, then the Indians came, they took our horses." Xavier returned to Cora's side, offering her water from his canteen. "I'll get you both to Helena," he promised. "First light we'll know," Cora interrupted, gripping his arm with surprising strength. "I won't make it." "We both know that." Her eyes, bright with fever, held his. "Take Elizabeth, please. My sister's name is Abigail Turner in Helena, Mrs. Myers. I'm not, please," she begged. "I can't bear the thought of her dying out here with me." Xavier ran a hand through his dusty hair. He was a bounty hunter, not a nursemaid. He tracked killers across the territory. He didn't care for infants. But the desperation in Cora's eyes was impossible to ignore. "I'll take her to Helena," he finally said. "I promise." Relief washed over Cora's face. With trembling hands, she reached beneath her blanket and withdrew a small leather pouch. "This is all we have," she said, pressing it into his palm. "Use it for Elizabeth." Xavier didn't open it but tucked it securely into his vest pocket. "Rest now," he said gently. "I'll watch over you both tonight." Cora's eyes drifted to the wagon. "Bring her to me." "One last time," Xavier nodded, retrieving the bundled infant and carefully placing her in her mother's arms. Cora pressed her lips to the baby's forehead, tears streaming down her face. "My sweet girl," she whispered. "My Elizabeth." As the night deepened, Xavier built up the fire and tended to his horse. Cora's breathing grew more labored, and sometime after midnight she beckoned him closer. "Promise me," she said, her voice barely audible. "Promise she'll never be alone." Xavier took her cold hand in his. "I promise," he said solemnly. "She'll never be alone," Cora nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Take her," she whispered. Xavier gently lifted the sleeping infant from her mother's weakening grasp. Cora's eyes remained on her daughter, a smile touching her lips as her breathing slowed, then stopped altogether. Dawn broke cold and clear. Xavier had spent the night keeping the fire burning, the infant nestled against his chest beneath his coat. She'd cried twice, and he'd managed to feed her some watered-down condensed milk from his supplies. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do until they reached civilization. After digging a grave beside Cora's husband's, Xavier fashioned a second cross. He said a few words over the fresh mound of earth, feeling inadequate but knowing it was better than nothing. "Your mama loved you very much," he told Elizabeth as he secured her to his chest with strips of canvas from the wagon. "And I made her a promise." He salvaged what he could from the wagon, a small trunk of Cora's clothing, a few baby items, and some basic provisions. Loading them onto his horse, he glanced back at the lonely graves. "I'll keep her safe," he said to the silence. Then, mounting his horse, Xavier Zachary set off toward Helena with a baby he'd never planned for and a promise he wasn't sure how to keep. The trail to Helena would take at least 4 days in good weather, longer with an infant in tow. Xavier made camp early that first evening, unsure how to care for the tiny girl who watched him with solemn eyes. She barely cried, which worried him more than if she'd been fussy. "You're being mighty patient with me, little lady," he said as he cradled her awkwardly, trying to feed her from a makeshift bottle he'd created from a clean glove and a handkerchief soaked in diluted condensed milk. "I appreciate that." Elizabeth accepted the strange arrangement, her tiny hands reaching up to touch his stubbled face as she drank. Something shifted in Xavier's chest at the gesture, a feeling he couldn't name, but that lodged itself firmly behind his ribs. By the second day, they'd developed a routine. Xavier would ride until mid-morning, then stop to feed and change Elizabeth. They'd continue until late afternoon, making camp early enough to secure their position and ensure the baby was warm through the increasingly cold nights. "You know," Xavier told her as they sat by the fire on the third evening, "I've been alone most of my life. Parents died when I was 12, been drifting ever since." He tickled her tiny foot, earning a gurgle that might have been a laugh. "Never thought I'd be responsible for anyone but myself." Elizabeth cooed in response, her eyes so like her mother's fixed on his face. "I'm not sure what we'll do when we find your aunt," he continued. "I made a promise to your mama, but I don't know if your aunt will want a strange man hanging around." A twig snapped in the darkness beyond their campfire and Xavier's hand flew to his revolver. He positioned himself between the sound and Elizabeth, who lay bundled on his bedroll. "Who's there?" he called. "Show yourself slow and easy." A figure emerged from the trees, hands raised. A woman dressed in men's trousers and a heavy coat, a rifle slung across her back. "Don't shoot," she called. "Just looking for a warm fire. Been tracking game since sunrise." Xavier didn't lower his weapon. "Step into the light." The woman complied, revealing a face weathered by sun and wind but still youthful, framed by copper hair escaping from beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Her green eyes assessed him quickly, then widened when they landed on the bundle behind him. "Is that a baby?" she asked incredulously. "That's my business," Xavier replied, still wary. "My name's Charlotte Mason," she offered. "I've got a cabin about 3 miles east of here, hunt these woods regularly." Xavier hesitated, then slowly lowered his gun. "Xavier Zachary, the baby is Elizabeth." Charlotte's eyes softened. "Your daughter?" "No," Xavier said, then hesitated. The fewer people who knew about Elizabeth's situation, the better. "Her mother died. I'm taking her to her aunt in Helena." Elizabeth chose that moment to start fussing, her cries sharp in the quiet night. Xavier turned to her, uncertainty clear on his face. "May I?" Charlotte asked, gesturing toward the baby. Xavier's protective instinct flared, but Elizabeth's cries were growing more insistent. He nodded reluctantly. Charlotte moved to the bedroll and expertly lifted the infant, cradling her against her shoulder and patting her back gently. Almost immediately, Elizabeth quieted. "She needs to be burped after feeding," Charlotte explained, demonstrating the technique. "Otherwise, she gets gas pains." Xavier watched, both grateful and embarrassed. Her mother didn't exactly leave instructions. Charlotte's expression softened further. "My sister has 4 little ones. I've helped with all of them." She studied his face. "How long have you been on the trail with her?" 3 days, Xavier admitted. "We're making slow progress." Charlotte handed Elizabeth back to him, showing him how to hold her properly. "My cabin isn't far. You'd both be welcome to a proper roof tonight, and I could help you get supplies better suited for a baby." Xavier considered the offer. Trust didn't come easily to him, but Elizabeth deserved better than what he could provide on the trail. And something about Charlotte's straightforward manner reassured him. "That's mighty kind," he finally said. "We'd be grateful." They broke camp quickly, Xavier riding with Elizabeth secured against him and Charlotte leading the way on foot. True to her word, they reached a small but sturdy cabin within the hour. Smoke curled from the chimney. "My brother must be back," Charlotte explained as they approached. "Daniel helps with the hunting." Inside, they found not Daniel but a young boy of about 15 stoking the fire. He jumped to his feet at their entrance, hand moving to a knife at his belt before recognizing Charlotte. "Charlie, you found someone?" the boy asked, eyeing Xavier suspiciously. "This is Xavier Zachary and little Elizabeth," Charlotte introduced them. "They'll be staying the night. Xavier, this is Jeremiah, my brother." "Daniel?" Charlotte asked, looking around the cabin. Jeremiah shrugged. "Went to check the western traps, said he'd be back by morning." Charlotte nodded, unsurprised, as she moved around the cabin with practiced efficiency, hanging her coat and rifle before washing her hands in a basin. "Let me take a look at that little one," she said, reaching for Elizabeth. "When was she last changed?" Xavier handed the baby over, feeling suddenly useless. "This morning. I've been using strips of cloth, but I'm running low." Charlotte tusked sympathetically as she laid Elizabeth on the table, unwrapping her soiled clothing. "Poor thing, and poor you trying to manage alone." She glanced up at him. "There's stew on the stove. Help yourself while I get her cleaned up." Xavier hadn't realized how hungry he was until the aroma of the stew hit him. He served himself a bowl, watching as Charlotte expertly cleaned and dressed Elizabeth in what appeared to be a small shirt. "It's one of my doll's shirts from when I was a girl," she explained, catching his questioning look. "Never could bring myself to leave them behind when we moved west." "You're not from the territory?" Xavier asked, savoring the rich stew. "Pennsylvania originally," Charlotte replied, settling in a chair with Elizabeth. "Our parents died in '73 cholera. Daniel was already out here, so we came to join him. Been making our way ever since." Xavier noted the parallels to his own story but said nothing. Jeremiah had retreated to a corner, whittling a piece of wood while keeping a wary eye on their visitor. "You're heading to Helena?" Charlotte asked. "To find the aunt," Xavier nodded. "Cora Elizabeth's mother said her sister's name is Abigail Turner, lives in Helena." Charlotte frowned slightly. "That's still a good 3 days' journey, even in good weather." She glanced toward the window where the first snowflakes of the season were beginning to fall. "And it looks like winter's arriving early this year." Xavier followed her gaze, concern tightening his features. "We need to reach Helena before the pass is close." Charlotte studied his face, then looked down at the infant in her arms. "I could go with you," she offered suddenly. "Help with Elizabeth. I know the trails better than most, and with winter coming on, you'll need someone who knows how to care for a baby properly." Xavier's surprise must have shown on his face because Charlotte continued quickly. "Jeremiah can stay with Daniel. They've done it before when I've gone hunting." "I don't need," Xavier began, but Charlotte interrupted. "It's not about what you need," she said firmly. "It's about what Elizabeth needs, and she needs more than what you can provide alone on the trail in winter." Xavier wanted to argue but knew she was right. His ignorance about infant care had been painfully obvious. "What about your brothers? They'll manage," Charlotte said, glancing at Jeremiah, who scowled but nodded grudgingly. "Daniel's 32 and Jeremiah's nearly 16. They're hardly helpless." Xavier considered the offer. Having Charlotte along would certainly make the journey easier, and Elizabeth would benefit from her knowledge. But it also meant another person to protect if the Blackwell gang was still on his trail, something he hadn't mentioned to Charlotte. "There might be trouble following me," he admitted. "Some men who wouldn't take kindly to me continuing to breathe." Charlotte's expression didn't change. "I grew up with 3 brothers and have been hunting these mountains for 5 years. I can handle trouble." Xavier believed her. The woman had a steadiness about her that spoke of someone who had faced hardship and come through it stronger. "Then I accept your offer, Miss Mason." "Charlotte," she corrected, smiling for the first time since they'd met. "If we're going to travel together with a baby, we might as well use our given names." That night, Xavier slept better than he had in days, knowing Elizabeth was being properly cared for. Charlotte had shown him how to prepare the condensed milk more effectively, and had fashioned a better carrying sling for the baby from one of her shawls. In the morning, Daniel returned a tall, broad-shouldered man with the same copper hair as his siblings but a more serious demeanor. He listened silently as Charlotte explained her plans, his eyes never leaving Xavier. "You vouch for this man?" he finally asked his sister. "I do," Charlotte replied without hesitation. Daniel nodded once. "Then take my horse. He's better suited for the journey than going on foot." They set out before noon, the snow falling more steadily now. Charlotte rode beside Xavier, Elizabeth secured in the sling against her chest. They made good time despite the weather, Charlotte leading them along trails Xavier would never have found on his own. "You never said what brought you out this way," Charlotte remarked as they rode. "Before you found Elizabeth and her mother." Xavier hesitated. "I'm a bounty hunter, was tracking a man wanted for murder in Virginia City." "Did you find him?" "No," Xavier admitted. "Found something else instead, the Blackwell Gang's hideout. They didn't take kindly to the discovery." Charlotte whistled low. "The Blackwells have quite a reputation. You're lucky to be alive." "So I've been told," Xavier said dryly. "They managed to wing me before I got away." He touched his arm where the bullet had grazed him. Charlotte frowned. "You should have mentioned that. Let me see it when we make camp." Xavier didn't argue. The wound had been throbbing steadily, though he'd done his best to ignore it. They made camp in a sheltered hollow as the snow thickened. Charlotte expertly constructed a lean-to against a rock face, creating a protected space for them and Elizabeth. After tending to the baby, she examined Xavier's wound by firelight. "It's infected," she said grimly, cleaning it with whiskey from his saddlebag. "You're fortunate it's not worse." Xavier winced as she worked. "Had other priorities." "Like keeping a promise to a dying woman," Charlotte said softly, wrapping his arm with a clean bandage. Xavier looked at her in surprise. "How did you know about that?" "The way you look at Elizabeth," Charlotte replied simply. "That's not just responsibility, that's a promise." Something in her tone made Xavier study her face more closely in the firelight. "You know something about promises, I take it." Charlotte finished bandaging his arm before answering. "My father made me promise to look after my brothers before he died, said they needed someone sensible to keep them from getting killed." She smiled faintly. 5 years later, they're still breathing." "You've done well by them," Xavier said. "Not many women could manage in these mountains." "Not many women get the chance to try," Charlotte countered. "Most are too busy being proper ladies in town." Xavier laughed softly. "I can't imagine you as a proper lady." "Good," Charlotte said, her eyes meeting his, "because I never intend to be one." The next 2 days brought heavier snow and colder temperatures. They traveled as quickly as conditions allowed, Charlotte proving herself an invaluable companion. She seemed to know instinctively when Elizabeth needed feeding or changing, and her knowledge of the terrain kept them on course despite the worsening weather. Xavier found himself watching her more often than necessary, admiring her quiet competence and the gentle way she handled Elizabeth. By the evening of their second day together, something had shifted between them, a comfort, a trust that went beyond their temporary arrangement. As they huddled in another makeshift shelter, Elizabeth sleeping peacefully between them, Xavier finally asked the question that had been on his mind. "What will you do after we reach Helena? Return to your brothers?" Charlotte stared into the fire. "I suppose so. Though Daniel's been talking about moving further west come spring, says Oregon has better prospects." "You don't sound convinced," she shrugged. "I've been following my brother's plans since our parents died. Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to make my own choices." "What would you choose?" Xavier asked softly. Charlotte met his gaze, something vulnerable in her eyes. "I'm not sure. I've never had the luxury of asking myself that question." Xavier understood completely. His own life had been a series of necessary choices rather than desired ones. "When this is done," he said slowly, "when Elizabeth is with her aunt, perhaps you could take some time to figure it out." Charlotte smiled, but there was sadness in it. "Perhaps." They lapsed into silence, both aware that something was growing between them but neither ready to name it. The third day of their journey brought trouble. They had just crossed a ridge when Xavier spotted riders in the distance, 5 men following their trail through the snow. "Blackwell's," he said grimly, reining in his horse. "They've found us." Charlotte's expression hardened as she scanned the terrain. "There's an old trapper's cabin about 2 miles ahead. We can make a stand there if necessary." They pushed their horses hard through the deepening snow, reaching the abandoned cabin just as the riders appeared on the ridge behind them. Xavier helped Charlotte inside with Elizabeth while he led the horses around back. The cabin was little more than a single room with a collapsed corner, but its stone fireplace and remaining walls would provide better protection than the open trail. Charlotte quickly set about making a protected nest for Elizabeth in the most secure corner while Xavier gathered what weapons they had: his Colt revolver, a Winchester rifle, and Charlotte's hunting rifle. "They're coming fast," Xavier said, checking the ammunition. "I count 5 men." Charlotte took her rifle from him, checking it with practiced hands. "I won't leave you to face them alone." "Elizabeth is safer if we stop these men before they reach her," Charlotte said firmly. "I'm a better shot than you might think." Xavier didn't doubt it, but the thought of Charlotte in the line of fire troubled him more than he expected. Before he could argue further, a voice called from outside. "Zachary, we know you're in there. Come out and face me like a man." Xavier recognized the voice: Lucas Blackwell, the eldest of the gang. He moved to the window, keeping to the side as he peered out. The 5 riders had stopped about 50 yards from the cabin, their horses blowing clouds of steam in the cold air. "You've led us on quite a chase," Lucas continued. "But it ends today." Xavier exchanged a look with Charlotte. "Stay with Elizabeth," he said quietly. "I'll try to end this." "Don't be a fool," Charlotte hissed, grabbing his arm. "They'll shoot you the moment you step outside." "I can't risk a firefight with you and the baby here," Xavier insisted. Charlotte's eyes flashed. "And I won't watch you die. We face them together or not at all." Before Xavier could respond, a shot rang out, splintering the wooden frame of the window. Elizabeth woke with a startled cry, and Charlotte immediately moved to comfort her, but her eyes remained locked with Xavier's. "I have a plan," she said, cradling the frightened infant, "but you need to trust me." Xavier hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Tell me." Charlotte quickly outlined her idea, a daring strategy that relied on misdirection and their knowledge of the cabin's layout. It was risky, but it offered better odds than a direct confrontation. "Zachary," Lucas called again. "Last chance before we burn you out. I'm coming out." Xavier shouted back. "Hold your fire." He looked at Charlotte one last time. "Be careful," he said softly. "You too," she replied, then added more quietly, "Remember your promise." Xavier nodded, understanding she meant not just his promise to Cora, but the one they'd made to each other with unspoken words over the past days. Then he moved to the door, pushing it open slowly. "I'm unarmed, Blackwell," he called, stepping onto the porch with his hands raised. "Let's talk this through." Lucas Blackwell, a broad-shouldered man with a thick beard and cold eyes, sneered from atop his horse. "Nothing to talk about. You saw what you shouldn't have, and now you'll pay." "I haven't told anyone about your hideout," Xavier said, taking another step forward. "I was just passing through, tracking another man, and we're supposed to take your word," Lucas scoffed. "Boys, take aim." The 4 men with him raised their rifles, all pointed at Xavier's chest. But before they could fire, a shot rang out from the side of the cabin Charlotte, who had slipped out through the collapsed section while Xavier distracted them. Her bullet caught one of the outlaws in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle. In the confusion, Xavier dived for cover behind a water trough as the remaining gang members returned fire. Charlotte fired again from her position behind a large pine, her shot clipping another rider's leg. Xavier drew his hidden revolver and took aim at Lucas, who was shouting orders to his remaining men. "The woman, get the woman," Lucas bellowed, wheeling his horse toward Charlotte's position. Xavier's shot caught Lucas in the side, sending him tumbling from his horse. The remaining outlaws, seeing their leader fall, hesitated. Charlotte used the moment to fire again, hitting one squarely in the chest. The 2 remaining gang members exchanged glances, then turned their horses and fled, leaving their wounded companions behind. Xavier quickly moved to Lucas, kicking his gun away and checking to ensure he was still alive. "You should have killed me, Zachary," Lucas growled through gritted teeth, clutching his bleeding side. "Maybe," Xavier agreed, binding the man's wrists with a length of rope. "But then I'd be no better than you." Charlotte approached cautiously, her rifle still trained on the other wounded outlaws. "Elizabeth?" Xavier asked urgently. "She's safe," Charlotte assured him. "I made sure of it before I moved." The relief that flooded through Xavier was so intense it nearly brought him to his knees. He hadn't realized until that moment just how deeply he'd come to care for the infant and the woman who stood before him. With the immediate danger past, they worked quickly to secure the wounded outlaws. One had died from Charlotte's shot, but Lucas and the other man would survive to face justice in Helena. Xavier found rope in the cabin and tied them securely to their horses. "We'll take them with us," he decided. "The territorial marshal in Helena will want these men." Charlotte nodded, retrieving Elizabeth from her hiding place. The baby was remarkably calm despite the gunfire, her solemn eyes watching Charlotte's face. "She trusts you," Xavier observed, moving to stand beside them. "And I trust you," Charlotte replied softly. "Even when you make foolish plans like walking unarmed toward 5 outlaws," Xavier smiled, reaching out to touch Elizabeth's cheek. "It worked, didn't it?" This time, Charlotte conceded. She looked up at him, something unspoken in her eyes. "Xavier, when we reach Helena." "Yes." He prompted when she hesitated. "What will you do after you've found Elizabeth's aunt? Will you go back to bounty hunting?" Xavier considered the question, realizing he hadn't thought beyond fulfilling his promise to Cora. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "I made a promise that Elizabeth would never be alone. I need to honor that." "And how will you do that if you're chasing bounties across the territory?" Charlotte asked. Xavier met her gaze steadily. "I suppose I'll have to find a different way to make a living, one that keeps me closer to Helena." Hope flickered in Charlotte's eyes. "And what about me? Where do I fit in this plan of yours?" Xavier took a deep breath, gathering his courage. "I was hoping you might consider staying in Helena too, not just for Elizabeth's sake, but for mine. Your sake." Charlotte repeated, a small smile playing at her lips. "I've grown rather fond of having you around," Xavier admitted. "And I think Elizabeth would benefit from having both of us in her life." Charlotte's smile widened. "Are you proposing an arrangement, Mr. Zachary?" "I'm proposing whatever you're willing to consider, Miss Mason," Xavier replied, suddenly nervous. "I know we haven't known each other long, but these past days have shown me what kind of woman you are, and I'd be a fool not to want such a woman in my life." Charlotte looked down at Elizabeth, then back at Xavier. "And what about my brothers, my promise to them?" "They're welcome too," Xavier said without hesitation, "if they want to come to Helena, or perhaps they could visit." but I wouldn't ask you to break your promise any more than I'd break mine to Cora." Charlotte considered his words, then gently transferred Elizabeth into his arms. "Hold her for a moment," she said. Xavier cradled the baby, watching as Charlotte removed her gloves and reached up to touch his face. Her fingers were warm against his cold cheek. "I think," she said slowly, "that I would like to see where this leads, for Elizabeth's sake, for yours, and for mine." Xavier felt something tighten in his chest, a feeling he recognized now as hope. With one arm holding Elizabeth securely, he used his free hand to cover Charlotte's where it rested against his face. "Then we'll figure it out together," he promised. They reached Helena the following day, the journey slowed by their prisoners but otherwise uneventful. The town was larger than Xavier had expected, its streets busy despite the snow. They delivered Lucas Blackwell and his surviving companion to the marshal's office first, where their capture caused quite a stir. "The Blackwell Gang has been terrorizing the territory for years," the marshal said, shaking Xavier's hand vigorously. "There's a substantial reward for their capture." Xavier glanced at Charlotte, who stood nearby with Elizabeth. "Split it between us," he told the marshal. "We couldn't have done it alone." With that business concluded, they set about finding Abigail Turner. It took several inquiries, but they eventually located her home, a modest house on the eastern edge of town. Xavier felt a growing anxiety as they approached the door, Charlotte beside him with Elizabeth in her arms. "What if she doesn't want her?" he whispered as they waited for someone to answer their knock. "Then we'll figure something out," Charlotte replied, her steady presence calming his fears. Together, the door opened to reveal a woman in her 30s, her dark hair and eyes immediately recognizable as similar to Cora's. She looked at them in confusion, then gasped when her gaze fell on the baby. "Abigail Turner?" Xavier asked. "Yes," she replied cautiously. "Who are you?" "My name is Xavier Zachary. This is Charlotte Mason. And this," he said, gesturing to the infant, "is Elizabeth Myers, your niece." Abigail's hand flew to her mouth. "Cora's baby, but where's Cora? William?" Xavier removed his hat. "I'm sorry to tell you they're both gone, madam. Attacked on the trail, Cora asked me to bring Elizabeth to you." Tears filled Abigail's eyes as Xavier explained what had happened. She invited them inside where they met her husband, Thomas, and their 2 young sons. As Xavier recounted the events of the past week, leaving out the more violent details, Abigail held Elizabeth close, examining her face with wonder and grief. "She looks so much like Cora did as a baby," she said softly. "I can't believe my sister is gone." "She was very brave," Charlotte told her. "She made sure Elizabeth would be safe." Abigail looked up at them both. "And you've cared for her all this time, brought her all this way." Xavier made a promise, Charlotte said, her eyes meeting his. "That Elizabeth would never be alone." "She won't be," Abigail assured them. "She'll be loved here, she's family." Xavier felt both relief and an unexpected pang of loss. He had fulfilled his promise to Cora, but the thought of leaving Elizabeth behind was more painful than he'd anticipated. As if sensing his thoughts, Abigail added, "But I hope you'll both stay close. Elizabeth should know the people who saved her life, who brought her to us." "We're planning to settle in Helena," Charlotte said, glancing at Xavier for confirmation. He nodded, reaching for her hand. "The marshal mentioned there might be work for me in town," he said. "And with the reward money, we could find a place nearby." Abigail asked, looking between them with growing understanding. Charlotte smiled, her fingers tightening around Xavier's. "We've found that we make a good team." They stayed for dinner, sharing more details of their journey and learning about Abigail and her family. By the time they left, arrangements had been made for them to visit Elizabeth regularly. The baby had fallen asleep in Abigail's arms, looking peaceful and secure in her new home. As they walked back toward town in the fading light, snowflakes dancing around them, Xavier took Charlotte's hand again. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "Staying here with me?" Charlotte stopped, turning to face him. "I've been following others' paths my whole life," she said. "For once, I'm choosing my own, and it leads to you." Xavier smiled, drawing her closer. "I never expected to find you when I made that promise to Cora." Sometimes promises lead us to places we never imagined, Charlotte replied, but I'm glad this one led you to me. In the gentle snowfall, with the lights of Helena glowing in the distance, Xavier Zachary kissed Charlotte Mason for the first time, sealing a new promise between them, one that had begun with a dying mother's request and would continue long after. 1 year later, on a bright spring morning, Xavier stood in the small church in Helena, watching as Charlotte walked toward him in a simple white dress, flowers woven into her copper hair. Beside Abigail in the front pew sat Elizabeth, now 18 months old, dressed in her finest and beaming at the man who had kept his promise. As they spoke their vows, Xavier glanced at the child who had changed the course of his life. Elizabeth caught his eye and waved enthusiastically, earning chuckles from the congregation. Charlotte followed his gaze and smiled, squeezing his hands as they completed their vows. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the preacher declared. Later, at the small celebration at their new home, a comfortable cabin on the outskirts of town, Xavier found a moment alone with Elizabeth. She toddled to him confidently, arms raised to be picked up. "Hello, little lady," he said, lifting her easily. "You look mighty pretty today." Elizabeth patted his cheek with a small hand. "Zay," she said, her version of his name. Xavier felt his heart swell. "That's right, and I'll always be here for you, just like I promised your mama." Charlotte joined them, slipping an arm around Xavier's waist. "We both will," she added. Xavier looked at his new wife, then at the child who had brought them together. "You know," he said, "when I made that promise to Cora that Elizabeth would never be alone, I had no idea what it really meant." "And now?" Charlotte asked, her eyes warm with love. Xavier smiled, holding the two most important people in his world. "Now I understand that I was promising her a family, our family." "The best kind of promise," Charlotte agreed, resting her head against his shoulder as Elizabeth giggled between them. And in that moment, surrounded by love he'd never expected to find, Xavier knew that some promises, made in the darkest moments, led to the brightest futures.